It is one thing to put a fixed price on advisory. It's another to go through the harrowing exercise of saying, we're not just going to put the label advisory on it and put a fixed price on it. We're going to name what the outcomes are. We're going to put a price on the outcome. And that ultimately, I think, is the work of the packaging, is to take this bucket of stuff called advisory and to break it out into specific outcomes and then work backwards to see all of the activity that drives toward that outcome.
All right, on this episode of the Modern CPA Success Show, we've got another great guest with us that we're going to discuss. For introductions, I'm Tom Wadelton, Virtual CFO with Anders. My co-host, as always, Adam Hale, and Adam runs our VCFO practice. Adam, welcome.
Hello, Tom.
So we're excited. Shawn Yeager is with us today, and Shawn's the founder of Upshift. Shawn, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
With that very brief introduction, we'd love to hear more. So tell us a little bit about your story and kind of what brought you to be with us today.
Sure thing. And thank you again, Tom. So the brief career arc, mine, is emerging technology through different waves. And so for me, as a graybeard, that begins on Microsoft's first browser team and having a front row seat of what the web unleashed, and into software as a service cloud, into things like streaming media, and most recently in digital payments and now AI. And so through these waves, the observation that I and many others have made is they are disruptive as much as they are empowering. And generally the first phase is efficiency. And so we adopt the technology, we gain efficiencies, and then that which tends to differentiate the real winners from the rest, that separates the pack, are those that change what they sell. They change what they package and price and offer, which I know is near and dear to your hearts and to those of your listeners. And so this really is a realization that here we are in another wave. And I would argue that it is probably one of the most pronounced, it's certainly in my life, if not the most. And we're in that adoption phase. And so where we're focused, where Upshift is focused, is saying, yes, adopt, yes, capture those efficiencies, but also quite critically, look at what you can offer, what you can sell, and how you can generate revenue in ways that are at least defensive, but hopefully are offensive and new.
That's fantastic. And you're already helping me learn something in here. And one thing, people talk about AI, and AI is so different from anything we've ever seen. In elements it is. I like that you're saying, hey, we've seen this kind of technological change before. I'm agreeing with another piece of your argument also, and we just talked about this a second ago before the show started. For many people, when it's you should be doing things with AI, a lot of it is personally think about how you can do it and look for efficiency.
Yes.
Not many people are talking about how are you going to change your services outwardly facing to your customers, which right. I think is the majority of your pitch. Is that
it
fair?
Is. And I mean, I know, having listened to several episodes that you've had, quite recently, you've had some brilliant voices on that have covered that gamut. And in short, yes, I think that is the second major step, is what can we now offer that we couldn't before?
Yeah. I'll let you repeat some of this stuff. Sorry, Adam, I'm interrupting you. I'll let you repeat a little bit of what I saw on your website, which is a little bit of the case for it. So you have said, here's what's going to happen in some of the accounting, and I'm reading through the stuff, and I'm happy to say them if you want, but you can probably do it better. What are we seeing the change that would sort of force someone to say, either opportunistically or defensively, you have to make this change?
Well, so much I know that you have covered in depth, but I will, at the risk of repeating, state that one of my primary observations and other fantastic conversations like this and at events and with clients, it is that the billing by the hour will likely outlive us all, for good or bad, but the billable hour as a unit of value is forever changed. And so, again, at the risk of repeating, it is the separation of the doing from the judgment and the trusted advisory that firms like yours deliver. And the value of that is proportional to the risk of getting it wrong, or the cost of getting it wrong, right? And I would suggest that as a virtual CFO delivering CAS, across the service lines, that it is so often the risk of getting it wrong that drives someone to a firm, to a professional, rather than DIY. And so while increasingly, and I see this with my fantastic accounting firm, we will do some of the pre-work and take it, to the consummate professional to sort of review, sign off. Certainly what I value, as I would, for example, in the legal profession, is how do I orient my choice and what I'm willing to invest in that service and most of all the outcome along the lines of what if I get it wrong? And so um, that is all to say that there is, I think, this unbundling of the billable hour as a unit of value. And I think that there is the ability to move from, say, on call, to always on, right? And so I talk about these sort of three shifts, and not to go too far in the weeds here, but that there are these three shifts that are occurring across delivery, packaging, pricing, and ultimately, what does that offer look like? So I'll sort of pause there, but I think it is an evaluation of the unit of value, which the billable hour has been a proxy for time immemorial. And it is what is now possible that we can deliver that will offset some of the compression and grow the business.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm most interested in kind of diving into a little bit is, I mean, everybody's always talking about just margin compression, margin compression. You're going to gain all these efficiencies, which, by the way, my experience has been negative efficiencies. Like there's been a lot of really nice to haves and there are really cool outputs that it's had, but from an investment in cost and time and everything like that, I've haven't met really anybody that's seen a huge ROI to this point. Not saying that it won't come and it won't be there, but then, then what ends up happening is customers, I guess where things are a little tough right now is customers are assuming or thinking that you are gaining all these efficiencies. And so there is this kind of margin compression that might not be available at the present time. It could be in the future. But so I'm more interested in, looking at it more optimistically on like kind of more of a blue ocean strategy to your point, whenever it comes to pricing and packaging. And so I'm curious of, whenever you're talking about delivery and those kind of things, are you suggesting that we start, is it changing the way that we deliver, which I think naturally would happen? Or is it also like whenever it comes to packaging, are we calling out something different? I mean, I know you work with professional services companies across the gamut. So legal services, accounting service, they're all kind of the same. So dive into that a little bit for me. Like, what does that mean in terms of like from a packaging standpoint? What are we trying to be explicit with our customers?
Absolutely. And I think, everyone loves a good framework, right? And so admittedly, we use a few, and one that I would offer is to take service lines, broadly speaking, and to place them in one of four quadrants. And this, should it be useful, is on the website. But starting at the bottom, those service lines that are exposed to the very margin compression atom that you raised, those that are and fully exposed, meaning, there's just certain things that are not going to be here in 6 to 12 months, right?
Certain like lower end bookkeeping.
Absolutely. I mean, it is. And I say this, not as a CPA, not as an accounting professional, but as a client of those services, it's just gone. I can spin up an agent in an afternoon that will do remarkable things, and that's not go me. That's how powerful the tools are, right? And so there are those service lines that are fully exposed. There are those that are compressing, and to your point, Adam, pardon me, for those who've had their hands on keyboard, hands on technology, enough experience, as you note, I think rightly, to sometimes be disappointed, but to see the arc, right? So where it's going. You've been through this before with other technologies, and you see that it is compressing. There are those that are defensible, and I would argue those are largely driven by relationships. Those are only, unfortunately, in some cases, so durable, but they're not to be trivialized. The relationships that your firm has, the brand reputation, its presence in the market, the trust ultimately that you deliver is defensible and durable, but you have to keep an eye on it. And then there's emerging, right? So what are the things that we can now do that we couldn't do before or couldn't do profitably? And so to get more concrete, I think it's the Carbon 2026 report that came out relatively recently, and it looks, at a number of these services. I'll speak to one particular client that we have, an accounting firm that has recently gone through mergers and has now candidly been sort of caught in a situation where they've combined forces, they've gone through a merger exercise, and are realizing that the talent they brought together is largely junior and is very much exposed. And so the work that we're doing is now mapping the degree and the amount of daily activity that drives the outcomes that the clients buy, that are juniors, and looking at two things. One, how many of those juniors can be upskilled and up-leveled? How many may not, and therefore will be, frankly, automated away. And then what's left is sort of this packaging exercise that says where we think we have depth from client relationships and past experience and success, and where we sort of see that arc of technology going. We've got some durable offers. We've got come back to CAS. We've got virtual CFO, and this is, I think, so much of this is about advisory, right? And so to bring it back home, I will say to look at advisory as an example, it is one thing to put a fixed price on advisory. It's another to go through, which I appreciate is difficult, the harrowing exercise of saying we're not just going to put the label advisory on it and put a fixed price on it. We're going to name what the outcomes are. Right, we're going to put a price on the outcome, and that ultimately, I think, is the work. To your point, Adam, though it was a bit laboring to get there, of the packaging is to take this bucket of stuff called advisory and to break it out into specific outcomes, and then work backwards to see all of the activity that drives toward that outcome.
Yeah. So advisory versus consulting. So sometimes help me understand there's outcome-based stuff where it's like I'm working on a project. To me, that's consulting. So the way I broadly, and this is just my own mental way to break it down, I consider consulting with an expiration date. Like I'm going to go in, solve a problem. I'm going to sell an outcome that's going to be a deliverable, and I'm going to walk. Whereas advisory is more relationship driven. And it's more of like, I'm on call and I can do these things. And now I still think that we do a good job walking through our value proposition on what those outcomes are of having somebody like us in your corner that knows your information, that can help you make real-time decisions, provide financial clarity, those kind of things. So we try to call those out. I don't know that we necessarily do that kind of on our pricing and package. We try to do that. We try to demonstrate that in our sales process, like our sales call. But you're saying like try to figure out how to even do that at a higher level, like on your website and those kind of things, like trying to call out the outcomes.
I think that's the direction. And I, and as Tom, you noted, we work across eight verticals in professional services. And so, there are those that are in different, certainly different positions, as goes the vulnerability to the compression of the billable hour. But to your point, Adam, we can take lessons from other fields, other sectors. And I think to answer your question, appreciating that it's difficult, yes. Can you name an outcome? The other thing I would say is with regard to advisory, I do appreciate that often that translates to retainer. And you are, again, paying to have access to, it's often difficult. I've been there. It's difficult to allocate the amount of a given senior person's time who would be called an advisor. But you're paying for access to time. And I think, or rather expertise. One of the litmus tests that I think is useful is the way advisory, I think, is changing, and I'm seeing this, is do you have what is necessary counterintuitively that a junior could execute some of those same outcomes, right? Do they have a playbook? And so if it is only the senior most people in the firm that can deliver that, which I appreciate has been historically true, then really I think we've sort of relocated some of the same problems, which is that there's the pyramid, The juniors at the bottom make the seniors at the top able to deliver what they are. But as the margin erodes, can you afford the juniors? Right. And so then that sort of trickles upward. And then ultimately, as I say, I think the litmus test is, could a junior or maybe sort of a mid-career professional, are they equipped with the playbooks, the data, the capabilities ultimately through things like an agent to deliver those outcomes? So, the too long didn't read version of that is, how far down that expertise pyramid can advisory be delivered? Right. And if it is only the senior most, then I think that is an indication of some exposure to some of the compression that we've been talking about.
Well, so let me ask you about that, because we've long believed that we create a playbook and a process, and we create the tools to be able to supplement people to a certain degree. Now we've done it with our playbook, and now I do think that like AI and stuff like that's going to help augment as well and make us better, smarter, faster, so that more junior people can deliver some of that stuff. But I think our futurist that we mentioned a couple times on here, whenever she's like, hey, when knowledge becomes abundant, trust becomes scarce. Well, so people are flipping from, like, whenever she says knowledge is abundant, knowledge, now the client already has the knowledge. Like before, we had to take, data and turn it into information. Everybody's like, "Ooh, that's crazy." Now we have information. And then we turn information into insights, like, hey, let me show you how you're supposed to look at this. Now all that stuff's being done for them. And so now it feels like, like the one thing that AI can't do right now is go like lay the plumbing in your house.
Absolutely.
Like, so we have to help them implement. So I think now we got to move from insights to action. And
Yes.
So I guess my question is like, when it comes to the value chain, yeah, before it was always a pyramid, right? Like expert on top, and then we try to leverage as many humans as we can underneath it. But now it feels like it's going to be a diamond where you still almost like, so my question just is, yeah, can we layer up middle of the road folks and make them experts? Or is it going to be, and I think the answer is somewhat yes to true, like we can lift those people up, but it feels like we're going to be having to sell expertise now, wisdom. And it's hard to do that with frankly, a kid that's 25 years old that didn't even like go through the hard knocks of having to figure it out, and is just like managing the technology. So we're going to have to like reinvent how and we're talking about this now, like training, we're going to have to do like more simulations, like flight simulations. We're going to have to do that with real-time problems or whatever. But we really are talking about like expertise. So how do you position that whenever in our world, you go from like being an accountant to a senior to a controller to a CFO?
Right.
How do I put a 50-year-old, very successful business person that's been running their business for 25 years, and I drop a 25-year-old in that seat and say, now let me give you all my wisdom. Hey, mom, can you turn it down upstairs? I'm still in the basement. You know what I mean? Like,
I take your point.
Like,
I take your point. And I think, and again, I don't trivialize the challenge of getting there. I think the point that I probably, didn't make as well as I could is the sort of, again, sort of unbundling or breaking apart of what does advisory mean, right? How much of that is, I get to call Adam on a Friday at 5 p.m. and he will pick up, right? Because I paid the premium for that privilege.
Sure.
How much of it is, in the world of a virtual CFO, how much of it is access to the outcomes, right? And so, not to, and you can pull me back from the edge here, but to talk tools for a minute, there are, I think in so much of this, there are three layers to look at. There's context, skills, and agents. And so, it is sort of a new pyramid, right? And context, as you perhaps are already working through, is how do you connect? Well, first, how do you capture, document, standard operating procedures, data sources back to your own accounting and billing systems? So, for example, you can now begin to track the actual inputs and the costs of those to an output. What did it take to close the books in actuality, not just hours contributed by various folks on the pyramid. And so that's all to say that this context layer, and I'm seeing this with clients and other firms, that sort of connective tissue gets plugged into Slack. It gets plugged into Microsoft Teams. It gets plugged in all over the place. And then, and this is one of the bits of real power, and it goes to your earlier point, Adam, about some of the disappointments with regard to efficiency, is you're taking these standard operating procedures, these blueprints, solution blueprints, workflows, whatever terms we use, and you're baking them into skills. And then you're running workflows, agents that for some it will sound like science fiction, for some have perhaps already built this themselves. They're running the playbooks. And this is kind of the point that I'm getting to. They pop into Slack, for example, or Microsoft Teams, and they ping that sort of mid-tier. I hate to sort of qualify people this way, but that sort of not junior, that sort of middle individual, and they've got 3/4 of the work done because that's baked into the context and it's encoded in these skills and these workflows, and it may then coach that individual to say, look, you need to go to Tom for the final call on this, right? And this is not science fiction. I'm seeing it, happen. And so that is a lot to say that I think the trajectory that we're on will up-level those individuals. But I fully take your point. Sitting across the table from a graybeard and being 22 is never not going to be an awkward, sort of conversation if you're trying to deliver something that is predicated on trust and depth and pattern recognition.
Sure.
But again, I will assert that as much of advisory actually comes down to outputs and outcomes, I think we're seeing that shift right now.
Yeah, and if you can still deliver the outcome, then
yes.
But a lot of times, like the outcome in an advisory relationship, I'm not saying that. And maybe this is where we've got to get better, is helping connect them to the actual outcome. A lot of time it's pointing them to the right outcome,
right.
Like giving them the advice towards the
Finger
outcome.
Pointing to the moon
I think we do have to figure out a way to then not only point to it, but then like grab them and take them there. What I mean? Like that's the missing piece that we've got to kind of somehow figure out as a profession, because we're no longer going to be able to just kind of sit back. We went, it used to be that we would just answer questions. Then we've shifted to a true advisor where we're asking questions and we're being more thoughtful about their business. Right. But now they can chat bot back and forth with themselves all night long.
Yes.
And get down to where they feel like they have a solved solution.
Which, by the way, can be in error, as you know, right?
Oh, yeah, well, 1,000%. And trust me, they're coming to us and saying, hey, I've already talked to myself for 4 hours and this is what I came up with. Right. And you're like, well, kind of, and so there's still a little bit of that right now. But then there's still like, cool, is that agent then going to make it happen for you? And so somebody still has to be able to make it happen. So I guess the question is like, especially in a virtual environment, how can we think about how we can help deliver those things or clients, I think is really going to be our next test, because we're going to have to do more than sketch out the outcome and point them in the right direction. I feel like we're going to have to take them there next.
Well, and I think, another thing I would offer, and it is, much of the crux of the work that Upshift is about. And it's borrowed from now almost 20 years of sort of discipline in the tech industry. So for yourselves or for your audience who either work with or have worked in tech startups, they'll be familiar with this process of so-called product market fit, right? And just at the risk of repeating, for those who don't know, for the longest time, and that's my career, has been always in technology, there was the so-called waterfall methodology. And I'll try to keep this brief, but the idea is you have an idea, you hand it to a bunch of engineers, you build the thing, you go hire sales and marketing people, you bring up the budget, and you force it into the market and hope for the best. And that's an unfair retelling of history, but that is effectively the way. And so 15, 20 years ago, closer to 15 perhaps, is this so-called lean startup approach. And so what this did is it inverted the entire process and said, we will not take the field of dreams approach, build it and hope they come. We will learn in a very disciplined, precise way what the existing pains and problems are, how pronounced they are, what is the market's proclivity to pay to solve it. Is it an annoyance, or is it actually, a needle in my thumb that I need to remove? And then only once we think we've understood the problem do we propose a solution. And so that is all to say that a lot of our work, and it goes to your point, Adam, is not to say, I know. right, what the package should look like. In fact, I'm certain I don't to the degree that anyone in your field does, but to go through a process of sort of rapid specification of what would your client base and perhaps others in the market respond positively to, desire, and ultimately pay for. So, the good news, I think, is that, again, obvious to some, is you don't have to make these changes and hope for the best. There are ways in which, particularly as we talk about productized services, there are fantastic existing disciplines and bodies of knowledge for going from I've got a hunch to I've validated this in the market with a service design, packaging, pricing, and sort of the first 30 to 90 days of client conversations to have before, and this is key, before we go invest $500,000 in capital to build that agent, to build that automation, to build that new product.
Yeah. And Shawn, I would guess, as you described that, I love that approach. This is likely a very repetitive approach. Is that right?
Yes.
I do this, kind of worked. Okay, let me test on something else or revise in that.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, so not a one-time thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of and I believe this is what we've done. What you're saying, your approach is what we've done in the CFO. We've identified pretty across the board, industry agnostic. There's 3 or 4 pain points that most SMB businesses have, the $0 to $50 million in revenue.
Right.
I think we've created solutions for them. We identify them as services rather than the outcomes, but we explain the outcome whenever we call out the service, and we've done those things. But as you start to move up market, or you're talking to other businesses where maybe, are you still suggesting, regardless, it's not one of these consulting things anymore where you just kind of go in and say, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and find where the problem is.
The discovery phase.
Yeah. So you're saying rather than do that, like in this market, because we have such short attention spans, we have this technology. Now we're going to have to be more thoughtful about what we were talking about, which is coming up with we really need to focus on learning the problems first, and then just having a solution to be able to show the outcomes of what we can do in those areas rather than the other way around.
And again, I appreciate the anxiety-inducing part of this. It is one thing for me to say, though I believe deeply that it is true, that we're in an age of going from sort of trawling with a net to spearfishing. And so consulting, and having been there, from Accenture to my own practices, I appreciate it is great to cast a wide net and then to see what you can drag in. And I would fault no one for that. That is a very natural and time-honored approach. I think, once again, AI is forcing this decision point where, as I mentioned, the anxiety-inducing part is, what are the 2 or 3 packaged offers, outcomes that we're willing to effectively bet the firm on? And it doesn't happen overnight, right? I mean, I've got a client that's spinning up a new P&L to do some of these experiments, rather than put it under the roof of their firm proper. And so there is there's a sensible way to sort of graduate, or rather transition. But that is all to come back and say, I think we find ourselves in places where we're going to need to do that work to define those offerings that will be what the firm sells, which will be painful in the sense that we may feel like we're turning away or turning down business. But I think it's what, on the other end of this AI transformation, survives, right? Because your clients are buying the same tools, your competitors are buying the same tools. And so, merely offering this vague category of services becomes a very difficult position to hold and to defend.
But I think we're also talking about the difference between marketing and what you have the ability to do, right?
Absolutely.
So you can still do those other things.
Yes.
You're just not going to that's not going to be your go-to market strategy. From a go-to market strategy, you really have to be pretty narrow in what you're saying. These are the 3 outcomes I deliver. And then, of course, if they need things that have tentacles that spin off, you can still do those things.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of, so what we're talking about really is just getting laser focused from a from a market standpoint.
Yes. And why wouldn't you, Adam, right? Why wouldn't you to continue to offer and bill, perhaps not by the hour, but to capture that revenue for as long as you can? And I mean, I was reading a piece in the legal field just this morning that hiring in law is on the upswing. And that, as this individual noted, MBA player level signing bonuses, for some of these lawyers. And so I raise that to indicate that for as long as a firm has either the market demand or perhaps has the brand or the partner equity to go command and capture that, of course, I'd be foolish, reckless to say,
Sure.
not that I expect you to listen to me, that you shouldn't do that. But I think for most of us mortals, we'll find ourselves in a place of commoditization and collapsing a competitive position, and need to be, the firm that you go to for X, Y, and Z, not the firm you go to for accounting.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. What about as you think about kind of that blue ocean strategy and and maybe you have an example in legal that we can kind of think through for accounting or whatever. What are some more of the creative ways that we can start thinking about doing things a little outside? Have you seen or anything where we can do things just a little bit different and create more space from everybody else?
Yeah. And well, I think, and stop me if this is obvious, but there are patterns that I'm seeing emerging in accounting and elsewhere where it is not engagement specific or end of quarter, end of year specific. It is always on, right? And easy to say, harder to build, but very buildable. So, I'm in projects where the client is building, this agent that as you drop new documents in, as there are, anything from receipts to W-2s to, I'm suddenly forgetting, is it a K1? I'm drawing a blank on the
You
file.
got it. Yeah,
Right. So, the K1, and I had this in my case, but just a side note, comes in late. And so there is no pull, there is no follow-up email, Tom, please send me that attachment. There is a Dropbox or other mechanism whereby I just drop documents, it ingests them, it does the same thing, and it updates the compliance position or otherwise, right? So again, may be obvious to some, but what does that look like? It's a subscription, right? So it is not a quarterly, annual package. It is an always-on subscription. And so in this one particular case I'm thinking of, a firm who has a client that has 4 LLCs and an IRS notice is going to take a different position to the care and complexity, or rather the care and attention they pay to sort of their overall compliance posture than would someone else.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So would you, even on the marketing front, then would you position it like AI driven, human managed, or like, are you suggesting even within the outcome, do you go ahead and call out, like, is there some kind of competitive advantage to say on the surface, like, yeah, we're using this technology, we're doing this
Great question. I think it cuts both ways. In some cases, depending on your client base, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear and misunderstanding and fear about AI and what that means. Does it mean, that that Anders has turned its clients over to a bunch of chatbots and you guys are out on a holiday somewhere, right? Which of course is not the case. The work's probably, you're probably putting in more hours than you ever have. So I think that's a positioning. I think to your point, Adam, that's a positioning question to sort of reflect on your client base. If it's a bunch of startups versus a bunch of 50-plus-year-olds, that's a very different conversation. There may be a window. I think that window will shrink rapidly, and it will. And I make this comparison often. It'll be back for those of us who knew what it was like to be forbidden from bringing a smartphone into the workplace because that wasn't an IT anointed device. I think we're going to see some of those same patterns play out. But I think what is more pronounced, and I think sets one apart as a firm, is the ability to put forward an offer, and I'm not saying it's all just outcome based. There's a ladder that I talk about. That as you climb that ladder, the confidence and the reputation, which of course is everything, that you can deliver that outcome predictably at a fixed price speaks volumes. Right now, that means let's face it, it ends up sometimes you end up eating some margin on the back end because you're sort of pulling the levers behind the scenes before you can fully automate the process. But I think the short answer to that question is the AI label could cut both ways. And even in the situations where it's positive, there's a shelf life on it. I think the bigger differentiator is how you promote what you offer, and price predictability.
Makes sense.
Shawn, if we can talk a little bit about how your firm does this. So
Sure.
what I read, you will work with the leadership teams and say, okay, this is the direction you're going. How could that look for an organization? Because I'm thinking of that along with this lean approach.
Yes.
That I'm guessing tells me, hey, in a couple of days, you're probably not 100% done with that,
no.
but maybe you are. So what would that look like? I'll
Yeah.
stop trying to guess what it is.
No, you bet. And so, thank you for that, Tom. So there is there's an assessment on the site, free, and the point of that assessment is per vertical to look at the service lines that are predominant, the delivery models that are predominant, how much of that is junior and therefore could be automated without senior oversight. And so there's a series of questions, takes about 8 minutes. And at the end of it, you get sort of an overall score and a position, and then your sort of level across a few of these characteristics, and ultimately, what might the first 2 or 3 steps be to take. And then there is also a mapping exercise whereby in a couple of hours we will do what I mentioned earlier, which is to map the service lines in these 4 quadrants, and you come away with, okay, here's our position. Here's where Monday we should start evaluating and looking at last quarter's billables. Is it shrinking, or to the point that Adam made, maybe business is booming, even though we see in 3 or 4 quarters that will change. And then the workshop is a 2-day exercise, one on site with the leadership team to go through this sideways pyramid, if you will, where we put it all on the table. We map all the service lines, all the lines of business. We look at, again, those that are most exposed, those that are most defensible, and then for either closing the gap on what we think will shrink or go away, or opening up whole new service lines, we put 8 to 15 ideas rather out there, and we sort of narrow down to 2 or 3. And then what is that? It means here is a brief that is delivered, 8 to 12 pages on average, that maps the whole service, that packages it, prices it, looks at the post, or rather pre-mortem, why would this fail, and ultimately delivers what leadership and or business development and sales will take to your clients over the next 30 days to rapidly have the conversations that validate or invalidate that these are offers we should take to market. Optionally is, we'll help clients get to sort of that first dollar of revenue for that new offering. But really at the crux of it is, how do we go from knowing we should do something to, what we can start doing on Monday to both defend against and grow with what AI is doing to the billable hour and professional services broadly.
Okay. If I tried to use an example, tell me if this would work, and tell me if it's a bad example. We have this leadership team and we say it looks like helping people do exit planning from a company is an opportunity. We think we've got expertise. We think that's where it's going, all these things.
Right.
We write our 8 to 12 page thing. There's then, I assume, a follow-up date to say, okay, then by this time, Adam has a responsibility to come back and test all these things out and come back and say, is this matching? Is that right?
It is. Okay. And it is so often, one of the things I will always point out is, and the questions that you might imagine, how in 2 days are you going to become an expert in forensic accounting or M&A law? I'm not. And so, the work is to take the expertise that the firm leadership has with the commercialization expertise that we have, and to work through this facilitated process. But to your point, Tom, I think the value is in going from, we know we need to do something, but we're billable, to let's get in that room in that day, work through it all, and you nailed it. Adam's now on the hook. right? And so these are the first 3 calls to clients he's going to make. This is the research that we're going to do. And then in 30 days, we're going to regroup within the firm, optionally with help. But we're going to regroup and evaluate what we learned about these proposed offerings. Are we going to go forward? Do we test them with clients? Or do we say, look, these are not the ones we're going to iterate and bring 2 to 3 more to market?
Yeah. I really like this. And I think you're supporting. I was at a conference called Build a Better Agency recently. So one of the client niches we have is agencies. Agency Core did a research project. And one of the things that they brought up I thought was interesting is they said, hey, when we surveyed all of you agency owners, we asked you to say, can you name the strategy that you think would solve your agency's biggest problem? And they said 57% of the people filled in an answer to say this would solve the problem. And then they said, but 17% of you said you're actually implementing that strategy.
Right.
And part of me thought,
it goes back in the door next quarter. It goes back in the door the quarter after.
Exactly. And part of me thought, okay, people are busy. They don't do that. But I think there is a big part of saying, I think it's that strategy, but I'm not sure I have a way of sort of validating that strategy before, in some cases, taking the risk to move that direction.
Yes.
To do that.
And candidly, the reason, the greatest friction against the growth of my business is not the price. It is taking 4 or 5 senior people in a room for a day and taking them off client work, right? And so I'm completely appreciative of that. And I think, if one sees where these things are going, and there is also by the way, a calculator on the website where per vertical you can drop in your annual revenue, and backed by a great deal of research, it's going to tell you what the compression is going to look like, what's going to come off the books probably in the next year. So, the point there, of course, is to say, is it pronounced enough to fix now? Or, maybe do we have 6 months of all-time highs before our clients catch up? And I think that's the real driver, is the clients are and will catch up, as to what they're able to do without the firm.
Okay. How would you respond to another thing at a conference that Adam and I went to? There were multiple people saying maybe being a fast follower with some of these AI tools is a smart approach. I feel like there's a risk in there because it could have people saying, I'm not sure I need to do anything right now, versus maybe what they were saying. Right. I'm curious how you would react to that statement.
I think it's a great point. And it is why, and being someone who's deeply technical and builds with these tools so that I am firsthand competent, there's a few things. It's a drift, but back to your point is, don't get married to one of these models. I think, it is outsourcing the future of your firm. If, we're seeing this in many industries. So in terms of tool selection, the real value, I think, is going through the exercise, and I'll come back to it. What is the context? What is the brain of the firm? Where does it live? Is it scattered across three different back office systems? Have we perhaps already built standard operating procedures? Do we have solution blueprints? All these things. And so much of it is the reckoning of it lives in senior people's heads. That's where it is. That's where the context is. And so to differing degrees, firms will have gone through that process of getting it out so that when, Tom and Adam, you guys wander off to the beach, and decide it's time, that the firm isn't scrambling to document what you know. Again, somewhat obvious, but it is hyper accelerated with AI. So the context layer is critical. The model and the tooling, I would argue, is very secondary. And then the automation that you build on top of it is key. So there's 2 ways to look at that. Can you afford to ignore it? No. And I rarely offer definitive statements like that, but absolutely not. Now, if you're 5 years from retirement, selling the firm, if you're looking to PE to roll up, your multiple, by the way, and I just had a conversation this morning with a private equity sponsor about that. Firms are already being sorted into 2 buckets, right? So moderate case is you got 2 or 3 years, you're going to sell, I'll be okay, right? Sure, to a degree you will. But if you're still in the game for some period of time, this will be a fluency, a competency that one cannot ignore. But as I say, the backside of that is, don't worry so much about tool selection, so much as readying the firm to drive these automations, and that's where the force multiplier is.
Okay. Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Because that's the problem is the tool selection is just it's so vast and it's just changing. And
Next week, you'll have another option.
Right. But I do think it is important to get yourself familiar with the technology in general. The shell can change and what it can do, but people have to get super comfortable with it. So whether it's playing around with like Claude or Copilot or Chat, even on a regular basis, and really leveraging that as much as possible, even just doing that and get used to kind of that no code response building stuff is really, I think, important for everybody.
Yeah, because until you've experienced the beauty and the horror, I say that tongue in cheek, right? The beauty is these magic moments where you see firsthand what's possible. It's a great deal, I think, more pronounced than the first time any of us probably had a conversation with Alexa or Siri. But that was a magic moment at the time. And so 10x, 100x that now for AI, but likewise to know what the limitations are, right? And I think in many cases, to gain some comfort that if you have depth of expertise, if you have experience, if you've built yourself in a high integrity way in your firm as much that you've got these relationships and this trust that you've earned, you're going to be just fine. In fact, you're going to be great because you're going to have the force multiplier of all this technology, but the technology alone won't be enough.
Yeah, just kind of bringing that full circle then for everybody, just kind of as a good recap, what would you say, like, what's your advice? If there's one big takeaway here that people should be focusing on and pull away from this conversation, kind of, can you boil it down to just kind of a recap here?
Yes. And I think ultimately the question is, and it's a shamelessly capitalistic commercial lens, but it is what can you sell after AI, right? That to me is the, if we were going to prompt engineer ourselves, it is, what can we sell after AI? It's purposely a big, broad question. And I think it invites a number of other questions. It does go back to assuming you have some fluency in what's possible, but that's it. It's not just, can we cut some headcount? It's not just, can we do this faster and still get away with billing the same number of hours for the next 2 or 3 quarters? It is, what can we do? Because I guarantee you, in the heads of the senior team, there are some crazy, brilliant ideas that you didn't have the capital to hire to deliver on. You didn't have the technology budget to deliver on. You didn't have the IT staff to deliver on, that can now be made possible. So I think that's the one driving question is, what can we sell after AI?
That's a great, summary.
Yeah.
Well, Shawn, this is great. I'm really hoping that people will reach out to you. As I did research for this, you've got some great information on your site, including, as you mentioned, there's a what about accounting firms? And so you can get specific to that.
Yes.
People can look you up at upshiftco.com.
That is it.
But also I would hope that they would reach out and learn from what you've done, because it does look like you've got a really good solution for that.
And I know, and thank you for that, Tom and Adam. I'm grateful. Sincerely, zero obligation. I just love having these conversations. I am the reason I didn't sort of tuck in at Microsoft for 25 years, love Microsoft, is because I'm more obsessed with learning. And so I invite, find me on LinkedIn. You'll see that on the website. Shoot me an email. Would be delighted to have a chat, and no other obligation or expectation than that.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you again. We really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, guys. My pleasure.
Thanks.